Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Good morning, folks, and welcome back for some of you. My name is Jared Bly, and I serve as ANCA's Clean Energy Program Director. I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth session on day 3 of OnRamp. Thank you for joining us this morning for another round of informative presentations and an engaging round of Q&A. This segment will focus on the local grid infrastructure for the 2023 World University Games being held in Lake Placid, New York, and the surrounding Olympic region. Our vision for this event is to establish the foundation for an inclusive region-wide transition to a low-carbon transportation future. Before we begin the session with our moderator and panelists, I want to take a couple minutes to cover some housekeeping and sponsor announcements. ANCA is an independent nonprofit corporation with a transformational approach to building prosperity across New York. With community-informed boots-on-the-ground strategies, we seek to keep wealth and value in local communities. ANCA's Clean Energy Program is driven by the understanding that investments in resilient energy systems, including grid and transportation infrastructure, build on rural traditions of self-reliance while providing significant environmental and health benefits. OnRamp is it's in a virtual format and offers several sessions over 5 days with plenty of time in between to learn, process, and connect. Please note that these sessions will be recorded and made available after the event is finished. While we begin each day with video on, participants' microphones and videos will be turned off during speaker presentations. Please utilize the chat box at the bottom of your screen to send in questions, and we do highly encourage everyone who has a question to share and to send that through the chat box. If you'd like to update your name and add pronouns, please click on the participant button at the bottom of your screen and scroll over to your name and select rename. There is no scheduled break during this session, so if you need to step away from your computer at any time, please feel free to do so. Next, I want to recognize and thank the organizations that have made this event possible through their generous support. First, to our partners at the state of New York. These are NYSDPS, the New York Power Authority, and the New York Green Bank. And to our sponsors, our session sponsor is National Grid. Our roadmap sponsors are Community Bank, Hodgson Russ LLP, and Nova Bus. And our plug-in sponsors are Clarkson University, International Paper, and Lion Electric. The moderator for this session is Noah Shaw. Noah is a partner with Hodgson Russ LLP and co-chair of the firm's renewable energy practice, where he works with renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transportation, and a range of other clean energy market participants. Prior to joining Hodgson Russ, Noah served as a general counsel and board secretary for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSDPS. And before that was senior advisor to the general counsel for the U.S. Department of Energy during the Obama administration. Raised in Warren and Essex counties, Shaw attended Brandeis University and received his law degree from Northeastern University School of Law. Noah also serves on the board of the Adirondack Council and the Capital District chapter of the League of Conservation Voters. Before I turn it over to Noah, I just want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. We are on our final working group session and we'll be wrapping up Monday. We have a great panel lined up and a great discussion to get into. So I'm going to now turn it over to Noah to introduce our panelists. Noah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Kate. I see you here and all of the panelists for being with us today, and I'm confident that we're going to have a great conversation. I did have a few slides that we were going to work off of, so if we could start those, we'll get into that. All right, so the working group today is about the grid. So how do we, from a regulatory point of view, from a technical point of view, work through the variety of issues that need to be worked through in order to actually build the infrastructure that's necessary to support the clean energy or the clean transportation transition that we need to make here in New York State in general, but more focused on obviously the North Country and in support of the 2023 games. So, we have a wonderful group of panelists who we'll get to in a minute, but the conversation will certainly focus on the technical challenges, the regulatory landscape that we have here in the North Country and in Lake Placid in particular. And we'll focus on solutions, because it's very easy, frankly, in this context, when thinking about revolutionizing really the electricity distribution infrastructure to accommodate a large build out of fast charging stations. It's very easy to focus on the impediments. And so this conversation, I hope, will really get at how do we fix these impediments and get to the other side of that set of issues. So next slide, please. The conversation was going to hit on grid constraints. So what does that mean in terms of electrical vehicle usage and potential solutions? This is about hardware, right? This is about the investments necessary and the chicken or egg issues that everybody has been talking about when it comes to clean transportation, of getting sufficient hardware and distribution equipment built in the places that need it in order to provide this infrastructure. We'll also talk about the Lake Placid Municipal Electric Utility perspective. Kimball's here, I'll introduce him in a minute. It's the situation in Lake Placid is different than in the rest of the state and a lot of other places, given the municipal electric cooperative presence of that set of rules and dynamics. We'll talk about the local requirements and opportunities within the broader regulatory context. So what does the North Country need to make this work that's different, obviously, from some of the more populated areas of the state where electricity prices are very, very different, and the needs on a day-to-day basis of the communities are different. And then we'll talk about opportunities to support the 2023 Games transportation goals. So it's very specifically, what do we have to do between now and January of 2023 to upgrade the grid and make sure that the investments are made in the system to ensure that all of the great ideas of clean buses and shuttles and the various different ways that we want to get people around at the games can actually be supported, because without the infrastructure to charge all of that equipment, none of it's going to happen. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking in general, and we're going to start introducing the panelists. I'm going to introduce all of the panelists right at the top, so you know who they are, and then we'll turn it over to Kimball first for his presentation. Once all the panelists have given their presentations, then we'll open it up to Q&A. So Kimball Daby is the electric superintendent for Lake Placid's Municipal Electric Department, where he continually strives to improve the efficient use of electricity in the village. Kimball brings several years of experience to the table, and as a previous lineman, not football, I mean climbing up poles, and a local resident, he's intimately familiar with all aspects of the department. Kimball is going to talk about an overview of the Lake Placid Municipal Electric Department, potential grid capacity challenges in the village for the games, and asset siting considerations, which means how do you get stuff built. Our next panelist is Matt Cloud, who is currently a lead engineer in National Grid's Distribution Planning and Asset Management Department. He takes this position after spending the prior 7 years working in various engineering roles at the United Illuminating Company in Orange, Connecticut. His work at National Grid includes spurring adoption of electric vehicles, time of use rates, in reducing grid impacts from EV charging and interconnection of large-scale distributed generation systems like PV, solar, that is, hydro, and fuel cell systems. Matt is going to discuss the potential challenges posed by the electric vehicles to the grid, steps, and also the solutions, I'm sure, steps National Grid is taking to support electric vehicle adoption, and utility challenges in electrification of transportation in the North Country. Our next panelist will be France Lampron. She's the Director of Transportation Electrification with Hydro-Québec. Since 2008, she has focused on transportation electrification sector In her current role, Ms. Lampron is in charge of the company's individual and collective transportation electrification activities, with a focus on the management of Hydro-Quebec's electric vehicle pilot projects and the rollout of the Electric Circuit, Canada's first network of public charging stations and the largest network of its kind in Quebec. Ms. Lampron is a member of the boards of directors of Propulsion Quebec, and she's going to discuss Quebec's Electric Circuit public charging network, an overview of the challenges to expanding services and lessons learned, and certainly identifying opportunities, I'm sure, as well. Our last panelist will be Zeryai Hagos. Zeryai is the Deputy Director of the Office of Markets and Innovation at the New York State Department of Public Service, where he leads the clean energy, wholesale market issues, utility business model, and transportation sections of the Department of Public Service, so he's not busy at all. Mr. Hagos has recently served as the Growth and Strategy Director for General Electric's power business in the United States. His responsibilities at GE included leading cross-business growth initiatives, managing GE's long-term power market forecast in North America, and serving as a subject matter expert for the US power markets in support of corporate strategy. Zeryai is going to discuss the statewide charging program infrastructure approved by the Public Service Commission, potential grid impacts from EV charging, and a variety of other issues, I'm sure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kimball. Kimball, thank you very much, and take it away. Kimball, I think you are, there you go.
Yes. Thank you all. Anyone that knows me will testify that I'm more comfortable on a pole or working on a project in the field than I am sitting behind a desk, let alone presenting. That said, I would like to thank Nancy Bernstein for inviting me to participate in Clean Transportation, the Adirondack on-ramp. I'm obviously in favor of all things electric, and I believe the potential positive impact of electric vehicles on our environment and on the region will be significant. In preparation for that, I'll share with you some information on the Lake Placid Municipal Electric and what we're looking at in order to help serve these vehicles in the future. Some background. Lake Placid Municipal Electric began operations in 1906. All electricity is purchased from NYPA. 29 megawatts is preferential power hydro allocation from the Niagara Power Project. The Niagara Redevelopment Act of 1957 required municipals and co-ops receive preferential hydropower. Lake Placid Municipal Electric's service territory is all of Lake Placid and most of North Alba, with the exception of Ray Brook and the Saranac Lake portion of North Alba. Just a side note, Lake Placid Municipal Electric serves 9 customers in the town of St. Armand on the Lake Placid Lake, which are assumed to be National Grid's in the National Grid service territory. Lake Placid Municipal receives all of its electric power from a 115 kilovolt transmission line that originates in Malone. Thankfully, National Grid does everything possible to keep the line well maintained. My opinion, there will never be another transmission line brought into Lake Placid. Lake Placid Municipal owns and operates just over 1 mile of 115 kV transmission line that runs from its old military substation to the Powerhouse Lane substation. Current sales, Lake Placid Municipal currently has about 5,000 customers. We add an average of 2 new customers a week. Our system demand ranges from a low of 7 megawatts to a high of 50 megawatts, currently peaking during the winter. Annual sales of electricity average 169 gigawatt hours. Energy efficiency measures have kept our system peak flat, despite increases in the number of customers. The distribution of sales is as follows: 45% residential, 35% commercial, 15% Olympic Regional Development Authority, 2% to the operating municipality, and 2% street and security lighting. Estimate that recent upgrades in preparation for the World University Games. 1 megawatt of load has been added at the Olympic Sports Complex, which is the Bob Run Biathlon cross-country facility, mostly snowmaking problem, and another 1/4 megawatt at the Olympic Jumping Complex. Some recent capital improvements. A voltage conversion was completed of a rural distribution feeder that had issues with low voltage due to being underconducted. A substation expansion, which is up on the screen now and is the newer looking structure to the left at our old military substation. This project added 115 kV protection to Lake Placid Municipal's 115 kV transmission line and bus. Prior to this project, National Grid provided protection from their Lake Colby substation in Cynic Lake. If a disturbance, such as a tree or bus fault, was to occur on the Lake Placid 115 kV transmission system, all Lake Placid municipal customers, National Grid's Ray Brook customers, and approximately half of National Grid's Cynic Lake customers would experience an outage. The impact of electric vehicles. At this time, it's not clear what impact EVs will have on the Lake Placid municipal grid. The installation of a Tesla supercharge station at the Lake Placid Price Chopper, 4 level 2 stations in the municipal parking lot, will help Lake Placid Municipal better understand the effects on the grid. One observation that can be taken from the Tesla supercharge station is that the load factor is low, running about 5%. This was discussed yesterday during the charge point presentation. My opinion, at a time of use rate that would encourage off-peak use when charging EVs at home would be a great benefit from a grid standpoint. Current EV takeaways. Lake Placid Municipal is working with NYPA to site a DC fast charge station. The work we've done on this project so far shows us that some locations are better suited than others for a charging station due to grid constraints. Constraints in Lake Placid Municipal service territory are usually due to the voltage of the distribution feeder. Lake Placid Municipal operates both 4,160 and 13,200 volts on its distribution system. Most of the 4160 is located on the west side of Main Street. But probably the largest limiting factor at this time in preparing for the infiltration of EVs is the rate structure for Lake Placid Municipal, which were established back in 2006. Lake Placid Municipal was in the final stages of rate review when COVID hit and is now delayed until after the state of emergency ends. By participating in on-ramp, I hope to better understand what Lake Placid Municipal will have to do in order to prepare and support the wave of new EVs that we know is coming. At Lake Placid Municipal, we're doing our part to support the wave too. We have plans to purchase an EV pickup, an EV forklift in the upcoming year. And thank you all.
Thank you, Kimball. Certainly, rate structures are a hot topic, not only, as you know, in the village of Lake Placid, but beyond that in the state, and you got to get them right in order for people to make the investments to build the infrastructure. So it's a great tee up for the rest of the conversation, and I'm sure our next speaker, Matt Cloud from National Grid, will hit on these issues, and I look forward to also hearing from Zeryai on these issues. So Matt, I believe you're next, so take it away.
Yes, good morning. Let's wait for the slides to get up here. Thank you all for allowing me to speak here today. As introduced, my name is Matt Cloud. I'm a lead engineer in National Grid's Distribution Planning and Asset Management Group. Been with National Grid for about 3.5 years, but been working on electric vehicle impacts to the grid for just over 10 years now. So I think Kimball's presentation was a great lead into mine as far as describing where National Grid stops and where the different municipal utilities take over. the one thing I'll say is that National Grid has surrounding areas, predominantly Saranac Lake area, as our service territory, and we support from our subtransmission and transmission systems the municipal electric systems that are in Tupper Lake and Lake Placid. So while we may not be the distribution service company in the area, we play a role in serving the overall area from a subtransmission and transmission perspective. So next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the specific challenges that electric vehicles present to the grid, because they are a load that is quite a bit different than anything that we have seen on the grid in the past. And my main message here is that the key to ensuring that electric vehicles can be placed in any part of the grid, but particularly in the Adirondack North Country, or early coordination with the utility company is really key to making sure that we reduce costs both on the utility side and the customer side. So just a quick little background for those that are not as intimately familiar with how we plan the electric system. We always are planning the electric system to meet the peak demand that we have on the system. This typically occurs during the summer months when we have large air conditioning loads, and that peak demand may only occur for a few hours at any point in the year, but the infrastructure needs to be in place to make sure that we can support it. So that is an important factor when talking about electric vehicle charging in particular, because uncontrolled electric vehicle charging can often coincide with those existing peak periods that we have when folks come home from work and plug in their vehicles at the same time as they start a load of laundry, start cooking dinner, turn on the air conditioning, lower, things of that nature that may increase that existing peak load. And that can cause the grid to require infrastructure upgrades to make sure that we can manage that additional load. So one of the things that you'll see as a common theme through all the slides that I have here to present to you is that early partnership with the utility is something that can really work to reduce the operating expenses of grid EV charging, and is a step that National Grid is trying to take and be more active in how loads are operated in the EV space, different than any other load that we've had on our system to date. And doing so can really reduce some of the operating expenses, both on the utility and customer side again. So one thing I wanted to highlight that we have currently that we've worked with a lot of different customers on to reduce their expenses and where they site EV charging is our National Grid System Data Portal. That has a lot of information about our system, but it also, most particular to this conversation, has a tab for our distribution asset overview that looks at the existing capacity of every circuit that we have on our system. And this is looking at the system peak that we have. We've worked really well with customers in the past to do high-level engineering reviews of these potential charging locations to make sure that when a customer does go to put in a charging site, that they're picking a location that isn't going to have larger than normal interconnection costs, particularly when looking at the faster chargers that have a higher power demand. And I'll note that this is live now, but as part of a recent DPS order, we will be presenting an enhanced electric vehicle load serving capacity map by the end of the year that will be posted on our website. And the last thing I'll just touch on is that through that National Grid partnership with the customer, there are a lot of different options that can be undertaken to manage that charging load and reduce the costs for the customer and for the utility. So the real key starts to become the capabilities of the fleet that's charging, or the vehicle is charging, and the operational considerations that play a really important role in determining what is the optimal strategy for each individual customer. So next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight a couple programs because National Grid is really excited about the EV adoption that we're striving to bring into our service territory in the North Country and across our entire service territory. So I wanted to highlight three programs that I think are really important to note. One is our Make Ready program, which is actually a phase 2 program. Our current phase 1 program is actually wrapping up today, and we're starting into our phase 2 program, which covers 50, 90, or 100% of the total Make Ready cost, depending on the different eligibility criteria for level 2 chargers and direct current fast charger sites. And it covers both the utility side and customer side infrastructure costs for eligible locations. Now, it doesn't include costs for the charging hardware itself, but it does cover everything on the utility side and customer side, subject to some eligibility requirements. And this is really important to removing some of the cost barriers for EV charging in general and EV fleet adoption. So we're really excited about this program after having a lot of success with our phase 1 program. The other program we wanted to highlight was our fleet assessment services. This is offered for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicle customers, which include the site feasibility analysis to look at the grid side infrastructure in detail and figure out what upgrades might be needed, as well as try to give the customer an understanding of what the bill impacts of EV charging might look like. And it will also take into consideration any managed charging options that are available to see what is possible to meet both the customer's operational goals, but also how to reduce some costs. And so these two programs are programs that are absolutely moving forward. And the third one I'm going to mention is one that we proposed in our rate case. So it isn't approved at this point, but it is something that National Grid is hoping to be approved for and move forward once we have that approval. It's a residential managed charging program, which touches a little bit on what Kimball said in his previous presentation, that looks to take EV charging at residential locations and shift it to off-peak periods, while also giving customers a really good understanding of how much their EV charging is going to cost every month by offering a fixed pricing model. So for different tiers of kilowatt hour energy usage, there's a fixed price that customers can charge their vehicles for. And from a grid perspective, this is really important because it makes sure that we don't have that coincidence between our existing peak system and our existing peak on our system and the peak that electric vehicles might be typically charging when coming home from work and during commuting hours. So, next slide, please. So lastly, I just want to talk on some of the very specific grid challenges that we have in the North Country, and really the grid infrastructure in the area really reflects the geography of the Adirondack North Country. As Kimball mentioned, most of National Grid's infrastructure in the area is fed from a single 115 kV transmission line that comes down from Malone. And then we have a sub-transmission network fed from that, as well as some sources to NYSDPS stations in the area to support that sub-transmission system. But the key takeaway here is that there's limited capacity to expand the existing infrastructure and limited ties between circuits because of the rural nature of the location. So while current capacity is adequate to meet all the forecasted needs, major load growth like the large electric vehicle adoption that we're talking about here is going to be a challenge, and early engagement with National Grid is really important so that we can understand what that load is going to look like and hopefully work on solutions that are going to make sure that the adoption goals are met while making sure that there's not infrastructure barriers to overcome that don't meet the timeline of this effort here. So with that, I will turn it over to Noah.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate that rundown. Next up is France Lampron from Hydro-Québec, and I'm very interested to hear what France has to say, especially given some of the constraints that Matt described regarding, the rural nature of our rural sort of distributed nature of the electric system and some of the limitations. Certainly, I'm sure certain of those impediments and challenges exist north of the border as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to France for her summary of what their experience has been with Hydro-Québec and how they've attacked some of these issues. Hopefully we can learn a lot. Thank you very much, France. Over to you.
Good morning. Can you hear me? I hope you can. Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to give you a bit of a different perspective. So as you probably know, Hydro-Québec is one of the largest electric utilities in Canada, and our production accounts for close to half of Canada hydropower generation. So we are very lucky that most of our electricity comes from renewable. Actually, it's over 99%. And one of the particularities that we have in our jurisdiction is that we heat with electricity. I know it's a rare occurrence. So what that means is that our grid is built, as one of the panelists said, our grid is built to meet the coldest day in the winter, so which happens maybe 5 days a year. So the rest of the year, we have a lot of electricity, a lot of leeway for electric vehicles, for instance. So next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk to you about the electric circuit. That is the name of the public charging network that we launched. We launched that 8 years ago. And back then it was very modest beginning. So we launched with 4 partners, 35 charging stations in 2 cities. And well, we were back then the largest because we were the only one. But today we have over 3,000 charging stations, both standard and fast charging, and over 500 partners. So again, one of the particularity that we have is that we were able to obtain a legislative change which allowed us to finance a massive deployment of fast chargers through the electricity rate base. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. We also created a joint venture. It's an IT company that has developed a back office to support the growth out of our network. So with that joint venture, we have full control of the IT system that manages all of the charging station and the customer experience. And of course, for us, like for anybody, electric vehicles represent a very important new revenue stream. So next slide, please. The visual that you're seeing on right now is the adoption of EV in Quebec. So it is going quite fast. Unfortunately, the latest data that we have date from July, but as of the August, I think we're about 82,000 EV in the province. The government objective for this year, for the end of this year, was 100,000 EVs by December 31st. Unfortunately, due to COVID, sales have slowed down a bit during the first month of the year, but we're not going to be very far off the objective. So we're expecting maybe 95,000 by the end of this year. So we're very hopeful that it's going to continue. Today, 95% of Quebec EV owners are a member of the electric circuit, so the public charging network. So we are very present and we have a good penetration. And this year, we should get 1 million charging sessions throughout the whole network. So last year we had 720,000. So you can see that it is a very important progression. That's why we needed to have a very solid back office to support us in that growth. We know that from literature rather, the presence of a public charging station is one of the main factors that influence people to go for an EV. So it is very important. Next slide, please. So in the electric circuit, we have 2 business models. We're deploying level 2, which are the standard charging stations, and DCFCs, direct current fast chargers. So for the level 2, it's our partners that pay in install their charging stations. So we have 0 investment. What we do for them is that we do RFPs, we select the best solution at the best price, we negotiate the contract. So that's all done for our partners. And we also are responsible of the customer service, the monitoring, and promotion of the network. So that's for the L2. For the DCFC, before June, we were paying 50-50 with our partners. But we realized that we were running out of potential partners. You have to know that operating a DCFC is not a profitable operation. So again, we went to our government and we obtained a legislative change to the law, the constitutive law on Hydro-Québec. And with that legislative change, we are now able to finance the deployment of the DCFC through the rate base, which is very helpful because now we can decide where we're going to put the charging station at the most optimal location. And since we pay everything, it's a lot easier to find partners now. Next slide, please. So the project that was approved by our regulator is a 10-year project. We're going to deploy 1,580 DCFCs, and that represents an investment of $108 million with $35 million operating expenses. And I want to talk about operating expenses because this is a very important aspect of deploying charging stations. I'll get back to that. Next slide, please. So in order to know exactly where we need to put the charging stations, we do an extensive analysis of traffic data. So we know who is using the stations, how long, and how much, and when. And when we reach a certain level of utilization of our charging stations, we know that we have to add in order to avoid queues. So it's very important to look at the way the charging stations are used and to monitor the status of those stations. Next slide, please. We're also doing some testing to prepare future. Right now, what we're deploying is a 50 kilowatt because most of the cars, the EVs now that are sold, cannot take more than 50. So when we're also starting to deploy 100 kilowatt because some cars like the Hyundai Kona or the Chevy Bolt are able to take over 50 kilowatts. Some of them can take up to 75 kilowatt. So that's why we're also deploying 100 kilowatt. But we know that more and more the EVs are going to be able to accept more power. So we're doing some tests right now, and we're testing 125 kilowatt, 160, and 350 kilowatt. And we want to know what is their behavior and how much we should deploy and when. Next slide, please. So I've been asked, what are the lessons you've learned through those 8 years of operating a charging station network? So one of the key lessons is the reliability of the charging stations is key. I repeat over and over that a stranded DCFC is worse than no DCFC at all. It really hurts the electrification of the transportation. So whenever there's a problem with a DCFC, you have to respond fast, and there will be problems. It is not a completely stable technology. It's very fragile. There's a lot of interventions that are needed. So you have to have operating budget to maintain the assets. And that is very key because we've seen it over and over in the United States and Europe. DCFCs are deployed with public money, and then there's no money to maintain them. And so they go, they break, and nobody fixes them. And that is the worst thing that can happen. So plan for monitoring, plan for repair and maintenance budget and resources. It probably takes a lot more effort than you imagine. So I put it in a little box. Do not underestimate the efforts to operate a charging network. You need customer service. You need it to be impeccable. So it's a 24/7 operation. What we're doing is we're using a mobile application to report problems. Now it's easier than ever. So at some point in our existence, people went to a charging station that was broken and they just left and we didn't know. We didn't know it was broken because if the problem is physical, there is no way for us to know other than somebody telling us. Now in our mobile app, the users can actually type in, oh, there's, a connector is broken on that charging station, and we get it right away and we can fix it right away. So you also have to be present on social media, and you have to have a dynamic website. So interaction with people is really key. And then another important thing is interoperability. So, and that is also another issue that can take a lot of time. So that's pretty much it for me. So I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. So back to you, Noah. Thank you.
Thank you, France. That was, Zeryai, are you taking notes there? Matt too? I think, I often think about the policy making and, regulatory rate structure questions with respect to the EV market here in the state or nationally. And it often feels, like we're trying to push a market that isn't quite there yet, right? So we're trying to make policy to get to a result where, the market wouldn't necessarily make those decisions by itself, left alone. But if you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance projections for the cost of lithium ion packs, right? So the tipping point for the cost of a lithium ion pack, so that an electric vehicle is about the same price or even less than a gas-fired vehicle, is somewhere around $100 per kilowatt hour. We're not there yet, but the projection is that we'll be between $60 and $95 per kilowatt hour sometime in the mid-2020s. What does that mean? That means electric F-150s that cost the same or less than gas-fired F-150s. And at that point, the entire world changes.
Noah, it looks like you may have frozen. Do we have audio with you, Noah? Looks like we may be having some connectivity issues with our moderator right now. While we work through that, and certainly appreciate Noah's insight and the information that he's trying to share, we'll move on to Zeryai Hagos and wait until we get Noah back. All right, we've got slides up. Zeryai, are you ready to go?
Yep, I'm ready to go, Jared, and I'll try not to steal too much of Noah's thunder because I felt like he was just getting to a really good point there.
Yeah, he was.
But as Noah mentioned, my name is Zeryai Hagos, and I oversee the Department of Public Service sections responsible for New York's clean energy programs, wholesale and retail market policies, and a truly exciting newer responsibility for me is transportation electrification. Now, the Public Service Commission in New York regulates the 6 investor-owned utilities. So Lake Placid's municipal utility is not subject to our jurisdiction. However, National Grid is. And as we think about the network of charging infrastructure needed, the IOU programs that we oversee will certainly support residents of Lake Placid as they travel throughout New York, as well as visitors who come to Lake Placid. So a couple of, before I jump too deep into the slides, a couple of my team's responsibilities at DPS, or where we're focused most with regards to electric vehicle infrastructure, are the impacts EVs can have on our ratepayers. I've seen estimates that predict EV load as it grows, and if it's not managed properly, could double or triple the size of our distribution systems, which will have an in-kind impact on the utility bills. So we want to make sure that that impact is minimized as we transition to a clean transportation future. On the flip side of that, EVs bring a lot of benefits to our ratepayers. There are environmental benefits, of course, but there's also economic benefits. And when charging is managed properly, EVs can even lower rates for ratepayers. So we want to make sure our ratepayers can access all of those benefits. A third important consideration throughout the industry, and Noah's touching on this a bit, is the utility business model, which varies by state, certainly by country as we look over the border. And in New York, for our investor-owned utilities, they're generally not permitted to own public EV charging stations. The commissions deemed that this is a role better suited for the private sector. So that is a challenge when it comes to kind of driving outcomes that the market may not drive on their own, and we have to be a little more thoughtful about how the utility and the private sector engage with one another. So if we could transition to the next slide, I want to share a little bit about the current regulatory landscape here in New York. In the spring of 2018, the Commission initiated a proceeding to identify and remove obstacles to the electric vehicle adoption across New York State. In November of 2018, all 6 of the utilities filed residential time of use rates that were designed specifically for EV drivers. And these rates, based on our analysis, can potentially save EV owners hundreds of dollars per year versus charging with base rates if they do it off peak. And that's on top of the savings EVs generate compared to gas vehicles. And as Kimball mentioned during his excellent presentation, this off-peak charging with TOU rates can have the additional benefit of improving system load factor, or more simply, reducing the grid impacts of EV growth. Now, in February 2019, to support charging infrastructure, the Commission approved a per-plug incentive program that provides fast charging station owners with an annual incentive to help address the challenging near-term economics while EV ownership is low and the utilization is low. And that can offset expenses such as demand charges, which are particularly challenging when there's very few vehicles pulling up to charge each day. And most recently, the Commission adopted a Make-Ready program statewide that staff proposed in early of 2019. And that program is currently in the early phases of implementation, and Matt touched upon it a bit in his presentation, and I'll go into it in more detail further in my slides. And if we could transition to the next slide, want to highlight a few key policies and state goals that underpin our statewide Make Ready program that I just mentioned. First, in 2013, Governor Cuomo signed an MOU with several other states committing to driving 3.3 million zero emissions vehicles by 2025. New York's portion of that commitment is 850,000 vehicles. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, New York has a fairly steep hill to climb in order to reach our 2025 commitment. New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act establishes a economy-wide 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions target by 2030 and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So shifting over to the bar chart on the right, the yellow bar indicates the emissions that are currently coming from the transportation sector, and it's the largest single source of New York's greenhouse gas emissions today. Looking at the 2030 greenhouse gas target in gray, you will see that even if we completely eliminated emissions from the electric power sector through our renewable energy goals, which are 70% by 2030 and 100% zero carbon by 2040, New York will still need to decarbonize the transportation sector or the building sector in order to reach our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And the point is that the 2025 goal of 850 vehicles is just the beginning. And we need to continue to accelerate EV adoption far beyond that with an eye towards our 2030 commitments. If we could advance to the next slide again. So this chart shows the location of the current DC fast charging stations throughout New York. The lower speed stations are not shown, but there's approximately 3,000 in New York as of today's presentation. The green circles represent Tesla's stations, which make up the great majority of the DC fast charging stations in service. As I'm sure most in the audience know, Tesla uses a proprietary charging plug and will therefore not be a charging option for all the vehicles that we expect will hit the market in the coming years. The red circles indicate the non-proprietary CCS plug types. And if we were to only show the stations with 150 kilowatts of output or higher, you would see there are only about 10 stations statewide today, mostly serving the downstate region. Now, given that range anxiety is consistently cited as the top concern for potential EV buyers, New York needs to significantly expand the charging infrastructure available to consumers if they're going to start making significant purchases of EVs to hit our 850,000 vehicle goal. And, you know, Noah was beginning to talk about battery costs. You know, I agree with him that, you know, mid 2020s is about when most analysts expect cars are going to reach cost parity, upfront cost parity with you know, EVs and ICE vehicles will reach cost parity. And you've also got fuel savings on top of that. And so, you know, there's a lot of models hitting the market in the coming years. So charging infrastructure is really the one key barrier that isn't addressed if not for a large program like this. So which just further supports the need for it. We could transition to the next slide. The statewide EV Make Ready program, which we approved in July, has a budget of $701 million. The budget was sized to incentivize enough charging to hit the goal of the 850,000 zero emissions vehicles by 2025. And that includes support for 50,000 level 2 plugs, the kind you might see in a parking lot at your place of work, and 1,500 DC fast charging plugs. The program is active now and extends through the end of 2025. Now, regarding the incentive levels, and Matt touched on this a bit during his presentation, but the order authorized utility support for up to 90% of the eligible make-ready costs for publicly located EV charging stations that use standard plug types. A lower 50% incentive level is available for sites with restricted access or that use proprietary plug types. Now, 20% of each utility's make-ready program incentive budget, which is $96 million in total, is dedicated for stations in disadvantaged communities. These stations are eligible for ratepayer support of up to 100% of the eligible make-ready costs. Now, as is evidenced by this tiered incentive level, public accessibility and equity are our principal goals in this make-ready program. $206 million of the budget of the incentive budgets are dedicated to prize competitions, incentives, and pilots, specifically in disadvantaged communities. I already described about half of that is to support make-ready incentives, which is a very much a market-based approach to driving infrastructure throughout those communities in need. The other half of the funding is dedicated to prize competitions and transit authorities, which are more direct allocation of funds, which I expect will support investment, the types of investments the market may otherwise overlook. If we could just transition to the last slide. Just a bit about planning and site prioritization, since this panel is covering grid constraints. You know, while site selection for this program is expected to be driven by developers and local businesses in the private sector, utilities have been directed to create a suitability criteria that will aid developers during the site identification process. The first column here, it really is around, and again, another topic Matt touched upon, which is helping developers identify low-cost locations where there's grid capacity that's suitable for EV charging. Utilities will produce a map by the end of the year that developers can use to identify those locations and overlay them with where they believe EV charging is most needed. On top of that, while again I mentioned we expect the developers will probably know best where the charging stations are needed from a demand or a driver demand perspective, utilities are developing their own capital planning forecasts, and to inform those, they're going to have to make assumptions about where EV load and growth is expected over the next generally 5 to 10 years. And so to the extent that they've got specific insight into where charging demand is going to take place and how that overlays with where there's grid serving capacity, we want that information to be available to the market, and we want the utilities to really focus their education and outreach efforts in those locations. And again, I think the larger sophisticated developers know where they want to go and have a process established to do this. But if you think about level 2 charging stations that may be at a restaurant or a shopping center, that may not be the primary business model for those smaller businesses, and the outreach and education we think can be very helpful in unlocking more investment in those settings. And the final piece of this suitability criteria is strategic locations, and this is really where we feel whether there's grid capacity or not, and whether we think there's going to be a significant amount of EV demand or not. There may be some reasons to still support charging infrastructure in certain locations if it's in a really underserved location that commuters will rely upon infrequently, but could otherwise, not be in a position to use battery electrical vehicles if they, didn't have surety that they could, get from one part of the state to the other. And so this is really on a case-by-case basis. We want the utilities to identify these strategic locations and bring them back to the commission for funding if it's appropriate. So in closing, I'll just say that it's a really exciting time to be rolling out a statewide charging infrastructure program. I believe it can support the goal of developing an inclusive region-wide low-carbon transportation system. And we're looking forward to developers, businesses, and consumers taking advantage of the benefits. With that, I think hopefully Noah has his audio back.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I apparently temporarily lost the bandwidth competition with my 11-year-old who's on virtual school upstairs. So sorry about that. What I was saying, and I think I heard Zeryai talk about it a little bit, and the work he's doing is just so important, and the work that everybody on the panel is doing is so important. And what we learned from Quebec and how they're getting in front of a lot of these questions is so essential, because by the middle of the 2020s, I think Zeryai mentioned the tipping point of cost for battery packs. When F-150s are the same or less expensive electric than gas, our system is going to have to be able to handle that, because it's just going to be overwhelming. And at that point, we can't be scrambling from a planning and infrastructure point of view. And that's not that far away. So with that, I think we're going to move into the question and answer portion of the program. We do have one question that came from participants. I've got a few others to the extent we don't get more, but the first one is an important one, especially in the North Country, where weather, as we all know, can be unpredictable. They like to say in the Adirondacks, if you don't like it, wait 10 minutes. I think they say that in a lot of places, but certainly we say it up north. And also, some of our electric system can be vulnerable. As we all know, those of us who were around in 1988 with the ice storm, and certainly in certain weather events since then, you can be out of commission in terms of electricity for long periods of time. And so the question is, if folks' ability to be on the move. If folks' abilities to drive and to transport goods and to get back and forth to the hospital and all of that is contingent upon being able to charge your vehicle. What are the contingency plans or sort of redundancy system planning efforts that we need to be thinking about to make sure that the system is resilient to ensure public safety in the case of long-term outages? So I think I'm gonna first check with Matt on that to see, you know, as the sort of grid operator utility person who's charged from a regulatory and otherwise is to keep an eye on these sorts of things. Matt, do you want to take that up, and maybe we'll hear a little bit from Zeryai also. I bet Kimball will be very interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. So yeah, absolutely, it's a great question. I think the key here is something that, you know, that we try to do every single day, which is building infrastructure with the reliability in mind. The geography of the area certainly is unique in that it does restrict the amount of infrastructure that we're capable of building because of the unique siting concerns in the Adirondack Park. But certainly one of the major considerations here is for critical facilities that absolutely can never lose power, generation is certainly something that has to be considered. There's also, you know, considerations for additional ties between circuits if their load capacity dictates it. But ultimately, you know, with the load increases that we're talking about, and as Kimball mentioned in his presentation, we're talking about a really significant load growth of the area, and ultimately the possibilities of bringing in new major transmission sources into the area to add additional reliability are simply cost prohibitive and very challenging when it comes to permitting concerns. So the key here is looking at the critical facilities and also making sure that the load is managed in a way that if there is outages that impact the area, that ties can be made and circuits can be rerouted to still accommodate that load, but understanding that when that occurs, the capacity of the system definitely decreases. So looking at locations that may have on-site generation to support additional load during those critical hours where, you know, outages may occur is really one important consideration. I heard the term microgrid thrown out. That's certainly a very important buzzword these days. That it is something that a lot of locations that have critical facilities are looking at, and we're a part of in a couple different locations across our territory. So there's a lot of considerations here, and I think the key here is to look at the operational considerations for the area and the sites to understand what's the best solution that's going to be most cost effective and meet the needs of the customers as well as working in the constraints of the existing infrastructure to control costs.
Right, and thank you. I appreciate that answer. And certainly, critical facilities are extraordinarily important, and we think about that from a distributed energy resource sort of perspective all the time. And EVs are an important piece of that that sort of equation. You know, and certainly, I guess, also interested in any thoughts with respect to, you know, just residential sort of security. That is. EV drivers' ability to get their car charged if the grid is down for, you know, a week. Zeryai, anything to add? And then I think I'd also really like to hear from France after Zeryai, just with respect to, you know, how Quebec has been thinking about planning for these sorts of events. Certainly, the weather up there isn't a whole lot better than it is down here sometimes.
So yeah, I'll jump in, and certainly would be interested to hear about HQ's perspective after my comments. So I think Matt did a really thorough job of laying out some of the considerations. What I'll add is, you know, this is something that Commission staff considered when we proposed the statewide charging infrastructure program. Really with an eye towards the actions that were, or measures that were taken following Superstorm Sandy, where in Con Edison service territory, over $1 billion was invested in resiliency measures and storm hardening measures to avoid power outages and provide additional, I guess, security against outages. You know, and that's things like elevating facilities, putting up barriers to prevent flooding from damaging critical facilities. But basically, I think, Noah, you used the term, right? What's the critical infrastructure how do you, do an assessment of what's critical, and then find ways to protect against it. For the Make Ready program, we ultimately decided that at this time, we didn't want to impose specific additional costs beyond the measures in place right now, because, we in part, we just, the market is so early, and investment is so low right now. We want to get the market jump started before we start making significant investments in putting additional process in place. But we're hoping that we'll see an uptick in access to charging infrastructure that will get some cars on the road. And in 2023, the Commission will be reevaluating whether the existing resiliency and reliability requirements for the distribution utilities are appropriate, or if additional transportation-specific measures need to be added to, whether it's every EV charging station or the charging stations that are incentivized through our programs, which could be a subset. So, I think the parallel is very very good to what happened after Superstorm Sandy, and our technical standards working groups will be also probably taking up this topic over the next 2 years in lead up to the midpoint review.
Well, thanks, Zeryai. And you mentioned Superstorm Sandy. It's worth noting that back when we were starting REV, right? So 2013, 2014, the entire impetus for REV was Superstorm Sandy. Not the entire, but the catalyst for the urgency to fix our system to be more resilient, more cost effective, cleaner, more distributed, was about ensuring that our system could handle significant weather events and outages. That was Richard Kaufman's goal, and we should not lose sight of that. And every planning process that we engage in needs to have that in mind, and it's great to hear that you do. And Franz, can you talk a little bit about Hydro-Québec's planning from a resilience point of view, and how you're accommodating and considering the risks associated with the electrification of the transportation system when you have potential outages that may come up? Franz, are you there? Franz might be on mute. Okay, so, did I hear you chime in, Franz? Maybe not. I think I'm going to ask another question because I think it's related to the one that we just discussed and is really important. And then I want to really encourage Matt and Zeryai, if you can, to frame some of these answers, not necessarily within the scope of the sort of broader state planning and policy making, but also thinking about how someone like Kimball, who's trying to run a municipal co-op and make its own rules, should be thinking about policy changes, infrastructure upgrades, and all of that. Because one of the ways, I think, to reduce some of the demand risk that we've all talked about, like how do you charge all your vehicles at the same time as people are getting home and turning on their dishwashers and lights and all that, is storage. So installing storage facilities at the location where the charging infrastructure is installed, so that you can manage the need for pulling off the grid at those peak times, and then making sure that the rate structures incentivize that, and making sure that the interconnection procedures are rational in a way that allow for that. So that's you can see my maybe I have a little bit of a prejudice in favor of those sorts of arrangements, but I guess I'll ask maybe Zeryai first, because I know this is something that he thinks about on a regular basis, and then Matt, and if we get Franz back, I'd love to hear her thoughts in terms of what they've been able to accomplish in Quebec too.
Yes, thanks, Noah. We do have, as part of the CLCPA, a goal of 3 gigawatts of storage, and so just generally, it's our mission to make sure we find great use cases for storage, so that that investment can occur, and we can help use it to meet our state goals. But thinking specifically about Lake Placid, I think there's kind of 2 general use cases for storage that we're seeing for vehicle electrification. One is, as Noah, kind of the example you gave, co-location with a station to either improve the reliability of that station or help manage the demand from the sudden increase in load at a large DC fast charging station, a supercharger. I think Kimball mentioned there was a supercharging station going in a shopping center in Lake Placid. Right, that can be a large amount of load in a very in a location that when the grid was built out, that certainly wasn't anticipated. 1 or 2 megs can suddenly show up, and that would be a considerable addition to the utility's overall demand. And you might also, I think from a developer's perspective, you want to make sure that there are rate designs in place that properly recognize the costs of that higher load, and would incentivize the developer to manage those costs efficiently, not distort it in some way. I'd say the other piece that certainly we would advise every utility to consider is the upstream projects from the specific node on the distribution network. These could be projects like non-wires alternatives, where if you see load growth happening in a certain location, maybe a transformer or a substation upstream will need to be upgraded. You could augment that with battery storage and potentially avoid those upgrade costs. And Matt, I don't know if you are familiar with some of the NWAs that have been proposed over the history of National Grid, but there's been a few in the Adirondack Park. And one item to note here is, there are a lot of long radial transmission and distribution lines where they go down due to storms, and that could impact your ability to charge a vehicle, certainly, but it also has the impact of just power outages for residents. And how do you value the benefits of avoided power outages with those storage facilities, and begin to stack all of the values that storage project can deliver? And actually, I think National Grid has has developed some really interesting ways of measuring those benefits for the more rural locations, where it could be some EV charging that goes down. It could be a few businesses, as well as a few hundred residents, depending on the location. So we have experience with doing that in other parts of the state, and certainly I think that would be helpful for Lake Placid if those are not investments you're already making.
Thanks. Maybe I'll take it from there. That was really great information, Zeryai. Thank you. And I want to piggyback a bit on that. And thanks, Noah, for asking the question, because I think DC fast chargers in particular, paired with storage, are something that gets talked about a lot and is a really interesting new technology combination that really does have some very large opportunity to reduce those demand charges that we see. And I know demand charges often get talked about from an operational expense perspective for charging infrastructure. But as I mentioned before, we are planning the system to the peak period, which is based off that demand. So, that does send the price signals that us as a utility want to send to encourage folks to manage that charging. And we have received a couple different applications so far in our service territory for direct current fast chargers paired with battery storage. A couple of them installed and operational actually just recently. So it is something we're starting to see come in, but I think, as you mentioned, when it comes to battery pack cost parity for electric vehicles, that holds true for energy storage as well. So hopefully, we do see a tipping of the scales in the next 5 years or so, where that starts to be a much more economical decision to pair those fast chargers with the energy storage. But that falls under the broad category of a managed charging solution, and there's a lot of different ways to go about that. Some of which doesn't necessarily require additional electrical infrastructure be installed, meaning additional battery storage to be installed. There are manufacturers out there of chargers that will monitor the service entrance to an individual customer, and across a fleet of level 2 and direct current fast chargers, ensure that those chargers are always staying below the service capabilities of that site and keeping below a certain demand threshold to avoid some of those cost impacts to the customer from demand charges, but also to ensure that the customer doesn't need to make a lot of infrastructure investments on the customer side. Because we've done a lot of talking about the utility side today, and that's a really important part of this conversation. But a large part of this consideration also is the customer side infrastructure, and what upgrades are needed on their side of the system in order to accommodate some of these really large charging demands for some of these higher power DC fast chargers. So I think that's a really important consideration, and there's a lot of different solutions there. So, for the municipal electric utilities that are looking at things to do, the different managed charging solutions that are out there, there's one I feel that is going to be able to be fit for every customer that's looking to charge a fleet of electric vehicles. But again, it goes really to what their operational considerations are. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really looking at the different options and engaging with the customer to understand what their needs are and what solutions technically are out there, while also providing all the input and insight into what the utility side of the grid looks like. So they have an understanding of infrastructure impacts on the utility side, and also what their bill impacts might look like. And that's part of the fleet assessment services offering that I talked about that National Grid has as well. So that's a really important part for the utility to play, is getting involved in making a customer understand what their costs are going to be and ways to reduce it. And there's a lot of different ways that might be achieved. And certainly energy storage is one of them, not only just at the charging level, but also, talking broader NWA, like you mentioned, Zeryai, energy storage is something that is being really seriously looked at for some of these rural locations where there are limited transmission sources. And it's not entirely a new concept, right? A lot of these rural areas were their own electric utilities prior to being, networked to a larger system fed from smaller hydro generation and other rotating machines before they became part of a larger electric grid that's networked across the state. The big technical challenges there is that a rotating machine is technically very different than a energy storage device. They operate differently. So there's some challenges to work through there. But as Zeryai mentioned, that is a big focus that National Grid has into looking at how we might leverage some of those new technologies to improve the reliability of these areas, but really paying close attention to the value stack and the business case that can be made to make sure that we're doing the right cost-effective solution and not necessarily just keeping things in a pilot stage.
Right. Well, thank you, and thank you, Matt. I do want to hear from France and the Quebec experience, but I think before we jump to that, I want to flip something over to Kimball because this is all fascinating. But we do have Kimball's got a clock, right? Kimball is trying to plan for January of 2023, and there are near-term issues that need to be addressed in order to have the market structures and the infrastructure in place to provide the services that the village and the surrounding communities are going to need to provide to accommodate. The World University Games are going to have more athletes than 1980 Olympics, right? So there's going to be a lot of people coming to town and a lot of desire for the games to be an example of how it can be done right, and also provide an infrastructure benefit for the community for years to come. So Kimball, just thinking about what you're hearing here and the different sort of policy sort of levers that are being pulled at the state level in particular, what are you thinking about in terms of planning over the course of the next couple of years to have infrastructure in place that you feel like will be sufficient? And what support do you need from the state in order to make that happen?
As far as planning, I think we have to look at every one of our distribution feeders that could support a DC fast charger and see if it has the capacity for it. If it does not, come up with a plan to get it to the point where it could support it. The other thing is to get the new rate structure in place so that we have the revenue to support upgrades. And while the ORDA has received millions of dollars, you know, the utility has received nothing as far as getting ready for the university game. So that's made it kind of tough on us. And, you know, I think there might be something that should be communicated to them that we could use a little bit of help on our end.
Consider it done. I think part of the reason really for this panel is to make sure that the needs of the local community and the needs of, you know, frankly, municipal co-ops all over the state who are responsible for maintaining their own rate structures and their own systems are known, because it's an important part of the overall planning process for reaching our goals. So, you know,
we're not a co-op, so we're not self-regulated.
Understood, but your local utility is unique in many ways, and you need a lot of support, both financially and otherwise, in order to get this stuff right, because it's complicated. One of the questions in the chat, and there are a bunch coming in, so apologies if I don't get to all of them. But one of them is, and I think you know, sometimes this gets glossed over because we sort of utility policy wonks kind of take this stuff for granted. But one of the questions is, will EV owners have options for special electric rates? That is, like utilities who use propane heat, they have option for lower rates because of the use. With respect to the estimation, and so secondly, with respect to estimation of substantial increase of demand on the grid, assuming that translates for the need for improvements, who pays for that? That is, you know, where does the money come from to actually make these upgrades? So, I guess I'm gonna ask Zeryai to take that, since as the regulator, you know, the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission are the folks who you know, make the rules about this stuff and say who pays. So Zeryai, over to you.
So I think there's a couple of questions underneath that, but you know, I think I mentioned in my opening remarks that the 6 investor-owned utilities do have special rates in place today that homeowner or residential customers can opt into an EV time of use rate. And you know, the average driver, I think, will save around $150 a year in upstate New York if they just simply move over to that rate design, do all of their charging off peak. The challenge, and this is something, you know, Kimball, you mentioned during your remarks, as well as, like, you know, ways to drive off peak charging. The challenge thus far is those rates have been in place for over a year, and last I checked, none of our utilities had more than, say, 2 or 3% of the EV drivers enrolled in the time of use rates. And so while they're there and they are create incredible opportunities to save money, most consumers don't seem to be motivated to switch over to those rate designs. And so finding better ways to engage residential customers and educate them of the benefits is going to be important if we're going to collectively get them to change their behavior and keep costs as low as possible. Matt also mentioned managed charging solutions. I think for residential customers, rather than enrolling in a time of use rate, which can be complicated, finding a way to, or a solution that allows them to plug in and the utility can essentially control when the vehicle charges. I'm a big fan of those types of solutions, and some of our utilities have already some of these programs in place. And the most recent order requires each of our utilities to have one proposed by November of this year, a managed charging program that's an alternative to time of use rates to hopefully sidestep some of the adoption issues. And then once, we've gotten through all of that and you still see, at some point you're going to have grid investments that are going to be required due to the higher load. If it's a new customer, a new charging station that's shown up, a certain amount of those costs are covered and socialized by all ratepayers. And so that is why, it's very important that, the utilities propose programs that keep those costs down. And there are cases, and certain costs are allocated specifically to the developer. But this is a new type of load, and it's going to create system impacts that are different than I think we've seen in the past. And so in the next year, as part of the CLCPA, the new climate legislation here in New York, there's an advisory panel that will be making policy decisions and recommendations in terms of how we meet our climate policies. And I think, that's going to have to be an important consideration of that panel, is how to socialize those costs, what costs are appropriately to be socialized, and do we need to make a change in how we currently allocate those costs?
Well, thank you, Zeryai. I am noting that 11 o'clock sneaked up on us. This is fascinating stuff, and I hope that some of these conversations continue. I hope that Zeryai and Matt and others continue to interact with Kimball and others as the planning for the University Games continues. I see there are lots of people outside Lake Placid interested. Also, I see Joe Pete Wilson on the list of attendees. I'm sure he's concerned about how this is all going to work as all those folks drive through Route 73 through Keene. That Stewart's parking lot is going to be even more of a disaster. So, there are a lot of considerations here, and a lot of work to do to get it right for the games, to get it right for the state. Rate structures are wonky, weird things that are complicated, and I commend Matt and Zeryai for trying to talk about them in ways that mere mortals can understand, but they are, rate structures are the key to the long-term investability, if you will, of this infrastructure. And we have to get it right because, like I said, in 5 years, those F-150s are going to cost the same electric or gas. And at that point, we better be ready. So thank you, everybody. I have a couple things that I'm supposed to say before we sign off, and I want to make sure that I do that. So let me check my notes real quick. First of all, our final session, Understanding Community Needs. So an interesting little segue there, is Friday at 12 o'clock from 12 to 1. And then Monday morning from 9:30 to 11:30, we'll be doing a summary of the key findings and local benefit roundtable. I'm sure you can find all of that information on the ANCA website in terms of schedule and details and the links to sign in. So unless there's anything else to say, Jared, do you want to close us out, or are we done and saying goodbye to everybody?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate, just want to thank everybody for joining the call this morning. We had an excellent panel and an excellent discussion, and yes, tomorrow afternoon session from 12 to 1 is going to be hosted by Clarkson University, and that is a different link. So as Noah indicated, go to the website and you should be able to track down that link or contact us and we can get it to you promptly. But other than that, just want to thank everybody one last time and turn you back over to your day. Thanks, Noah.
All right. Bye-bye.